Hi everybody, this is John Broughton from Danfoss. Welcome to another live stream. Today we're doing system health and refrigerants. This is a sort of wrap up to my Cold Room Essential webinar series that I've been doing over the past few months. We did the selection match between the condenser unit and the evaporator. We did installation best practices, spent some time looking at the commissioning best practices, then looking at compressor and compressor failures, and then some discussion on refrigerants. So today we are hoping to take some questions on those topics, but also focusing on sort of system health and refrigerants as well. So hi from India. Hi Rishab, nice to see you, and Mohammed. So yeah, please let me know where you guys are dialing in from, where everybody is in the world. How life is. I'm interested to doing job. I'm Mohammed. Okay, that's good. So Botswana. Okay, nice to see somebody from Botswana. I used to live in Africa many years ago. So yeah, hi to Botswana. So yeah, we're just going to talk about sort of cold rooms and all those sort of topics, system health and refrigerants. Just to let you know, we are broadcasting on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter today. So we're live on all of those. So okay, everybody's jumping in now. So UAE, I've been to UAE in my past. India, Sweden, Indonesia, India again, Saudi. Okay, lots of people. Sweden, Tunisia, that's a good one. Turkey. Okay, so lots of people diving in. So yeah, so as I said, we're doing this live stream to talk about system health, refrigerants, also go over the topics that I did in the various cold room webinars. Just looking to see everybody, where people are coming in from. London, okay, hometown almost. New Zealand, nice part of the world. India again, lots of people on LinkedIn, some people on YouTube. So yeah, Pakistan. Okay, fantastic. So yeah, and I'm here basically to answer your questions. So post as many questions as we can in the chat, and we can take them. Cameroon, India again. Fantastic. So yeah, let's post some questions. Let's talk about cold rooms generally, but also system health, refrigerants, things like that. On the moment, you'll see on the screen, we've got a nice picture of a scroll compressor, and that's what I call the heart of the system. So we've got to look after our refrigeration system, and as it says there on the screen, it is the heart of the system. We've got to look after our compressor. Now, I've put a few things up on the slide there. We've got the discharge temperature. And I'm just looking at the questions that are coming in as well. So okay, Poland, Qatar. Okay, so yeah, if you post your questions, then they'll pop up on the screen and we can take the questions, and I can sort of jump in between the questions as we go. But yeah, that's the main aim of today, is to talk about the questions. So we have first question come in. How do you know what your evaporating temperature should be? And that will be posted on the screen very shortly. So how do we know what your evaporating temperature should be? Well, that really comes down to what product you're actually storing in your cold room. So let's say you want your cold room at sort of +2, for example, then you would be evaporating around about -5. That all depends on the relative humidity of the product that you've got in your cold room. And that is quite sort of sensitive, depending on the product that you've got in your store. So let's say you've got fresh fruit, for example. You want a nice high humidity so we don't dry the product out. If you want a nice high humidity, basically you want quite a small temperature difference on your system. If you've got dried fish, for example, you want a very low temperature difference, so we don't want to dry that product. We don't want to make that product moist. So it all depends on the product that you've got in your store and the humidity, or the relative humidity, that you want within your cold room. There are many books and pieces of literature, depending, that will explain your temperature difference, evaporating temperature, etc. Generally, if you want something like 80% humidity, and I'm just looking down at some the notes that I've used over the years, if you want something like 80% humidity, you want roughly 8 to 9 Kelvin difference between your evaporating temperature and your room temperature. If you want a very low relative humidity, then you want something like a 10K temperature difference. So if you had a room of +5, you'd be evaporating at -5, so you've got that 10K difference. So that answers that one, hopefully. Another question has come up from, can you talk about expansion device and setting it on commissioning? Yeah, that's a very good question, and one that is a sort of favorite one of mine. Now, what I'm going to try and do is swap between slides here, so just bear with me a little bit. Hi from Morocco. That's a new one for me. Let me just, so I'm just going to flip between my many presentations here, so bear with me. And let's just, let me just play around a minute. This always gets quite challenging when we're trying to share many different screens. So we want that one, and we want that one. So let me just put that one up on the screen a minute. So we're just going to talk about expansion valves, just to answer that question. So let's just share that one. So that can go up on the screen. And then hopefully you guys and ladies can see that one. So Sean asks, can you talk about expansion device and setting it on commissioning? Basically, a expansion device comes with a, and I don't like to use this word, but it basically comes with a presetting for the superheat. And you need to, on commissioning, you need to set up your superheat in your evaporator. The way that you do this, that hopefully on the screen we can see that nice slide of your evaporator, and we've got our expansion device, and hopefully you guys can see my mouse. I think you can. So we've got our expansion device, we've got our evaporator, and we've got we are on this example, we're evaporating with 134A. Our evaporator pressure is 1.4 bar, which gives us -5 degrees C. So we would do that on, the old refrigerant slider, that sort of, device. We used to clean the ice off the windscreens when I was much younger with those in the winter time. But yeah, we use our refrigerant slider, and then we work out with that particular pressure on that particular refrigerant. So 134A at 1.42 bar, and that is -5 evaporating. Now, then we measure with a temperature probe on the outlet of the evaporator, and we can see there we are reading at +2 degrees C. So that means we have 7K superheat on our evaporator, and 7K, 8K is about where we want to be. Don't go much lower than sort of 6 Kelvin. We don't want to risk getting liquid back to our machine. We don't want something high as sort of 10, 12 Kelvin on our evaporator, and then we're not utilizing the surface area of our evaporator. So hopefully, Sean, that answers that sort of question. Superheat is a very interesting sort of topic, and I'm going to flick to my whiteboard now. So I'll just stop sharing my screen. There we go. Thank you very much, my beautiful people in the background. If we talk about our evaporator a second, so we have our nice simple evaporator, got our expansion device up here, suction coming out, bulb on our expansion, on our suction line coming out. Now, the basic idea is that we have our expansion device and we expand that liquid into our evaporator. And we want to have let's say, refrigerant liquid vapor mix in that evaporator as much as we can. So we want to utilize the whole surface area of that evaporator to get our duty. Now, if we have, let's say, a 7K superheat, we would be utilizing the majority of that evaporator. So we'll have liquid, you know, boiling off all the way down the evaporator to maybe somewhere there. And then we've got that part of the evaporator for the superheated refrigerant. And we've got vapor coming back down the suction line, back to our compressor, which is most important. If we have a very high superheat, basically what it means is that the part of the evaporator that we are utilizing gets smaller, so that we don't get the same amount of duty or capacity from that evaporator. If we've got a very, let's say, small superheat, let's say we had 2K superheat, then we would be utilizing maybe that much of the evaporator. And then we've got to be very careful, because we could have liquid coming back down the suction line to our machine, which is, you know, not good. We don't want to break the compressor. So when you're commissioning, Sean, most important, check your superheat on your evaporator, but then also check the suction superheat coming back to the machine as well, because we don't want to cook the machine either. So hopefully that sort of answers that question. We've got another question come up. Can R404 work in the range of evaporating +5 to 0? Yes, it can. I mean, R404A is one of the, you know, good refrigerants, let's say, and can be used in various applications. So yeah, not a problem at all. Again, use your comparator, check your pressures and temperatures, but yeah, 404A is okay for that. Okay, another question's come in from Limesh. I'll answer this as best I can. We've got lots of comments coming in. Okay, why use, and I think that means brine solution, for a brine chiller, and can you explain the working of a brine chiller? Yeah, let's go back to the famous whiteboard. It's getting well used, my whiteboard today. So brine chillers. Let's have a think about this. I mean, brine is a solution of water stroke salt in its basic sort of format. We put the salt in the brine so we don't freeze the water, and then that brine solution is pumped round a system. Could be a plate heat exchanger, could be a tube-in-tube heat exchanger, could be a shell and tube heat exchanger, to cool a process, let's say. So in sort of simple terms, and these are sort of systems that I've worked on in the past, let's say we have our, and we'll just call it a chiller with our compressors, and we'll have our evaporator, we'll have our compressors over here, and we will basically circulate brine through this chiller barrel. So we'll go in and we'll go out, and that will, it could go to a storage vessel, for example, and that will then go to our let's call it a process. How do we sort of show that? And then we'll come back out of the process, back through the chiller, and that tank will maintain a level. We'll have a pump. That's in its sort of very basic format. The main thing that we've got to be careful of is our evaporating temperature here, and the consistency of the brine, the specific gravity of the brine, so we don't freeze the brine. And you can find that there's various charts, etc., that will tell you the specific gravity of the brine that you need so you don't freeze it. The other way to do it, instead of using brine, would be to use something like inhibited glycol. Same thing, the same solution that you'd use in your car cooling system, for example, so that it doesn't freeze. So yeah, hope that sort of it very quickly mesh about, brine cooling. There's a whole host of sort of processes that you can do on the end of that. Could be as I said, a plate heat exchanger, could be an evaporator. We've done the same thing for milk cooling in the past, where that process is actually a plate-in-plate heat exchanger. So we've got brine on one side, or this was food-grade glycol, and then milk out the other side. So it's a way to sort of separate your process side, which is generally a food stuff, whether it's milk or beer or whatever, and in your chiller you could use it could be an ammonia chiller, for example, so that you're actually separating the ammonia using the brine as your cooling medium, and then that's your food side. So yeah, very different ways of doing it. Okay, another question has come in. Lots of questions coming in, so we'll take them one at a time. How do we derive the right quantity of refrigerant charge for a refrigeration system? Yeah, that's a very good question. Charge is an interesting discussion, and I'll just clean that off there. When we talk about refrigerant charge, basically you can estimate your charge of your system, and you can estimate that by the length of the liquid line, the size of that liquid line. That will give you a base quantity, if you like. Then also take the volume of your receiver, and that will give you a indication of the amount of refrigerant that you will need in that system. Basically, and this goes back to the way I was taught when I was much younger, when I was on the tools, is that you charge a system to a full sight glass, which is, I would say, still the best way to make sure that you are there or thereabouts. But then you also need to make sure your suction pressure and your suction temperature, discharge pressure is where it should be. Now, there is a very good tool that we have within Danfoss, and I'll just share my screen in a moment and I'll show you, but I just need to load something up. So I'll just stop sharing my screen a second, and I'll just load up Danfoss Cool Selector software, which basically gives you a good indication of the pressures and temperatures that you should see around a system. So let's just load that up on the other screen a second, and I'll show you basically what that would look like. So if we go to that one there, okay, let's share the screen again, and let's put that one on the screen. So hopefully you can all see that on the screen now. So this is Danfoss Cool Selector software, totally free. So please go to Danfoss Cool Selector, and let's just click later on that one. So this is a condensing unit selection. You can also do it on the compressor selection as well. And if you put in your system information, your refrigerant information, etc., I'll just choose 449, for example. So we've got our cooling capacity, our evaporating temperature, ambient temperature, things like that. And basically what Cool Selector does is it gives you the pH diagram, which is all well and good, but then it also gives you a nice pictorial system picture of your refrigeration system. And then on the left-hand side here, it gives us a description of the points. So we've got compressor suction as 0.1, compressor discharge as 0.2, and it will tell you your temperature and pressure that you would expect on that system given the evaporating temperature and the ambient temperature. So this is a very good way to double check on site when you're commissioning a system, is to make sure that your suction pressure, discharge temperature, liquid temperature, etc. is there or thereabouts where it should be. So yeah, it's something that I use quite a bit when I'm on site with condensing units, just to double check that it is what it is. So yeah, that's Danfoss Cool Selector software. So I hope that answers that one. Let's just, I'll stop sharing as well. So hope that answers that question. Rishab, another question has come up. How do we control humidity with high efficiency cooling? Yeah, I guess that's quite an involved question. If you're talking about high efficiency cooling, meaning that you've got a flooded evaporator, for example, where you would have a very low superheat, or basically no superheat if we're talking a flooded coil. Depending on the product that you are trying to control, you might have to have an external device in there that is creating humidity to keep the humidity at the right level. I've worked in computer cooling rooms, for example, where they want a particular humidity, and we've got a refrigeration system there that is drying the air out, and then they will actually install a VAPAC bottle, for want of a better word, which was a vessel which you had filled with distilled water, and you generated steam in that vessel, and that created the right humidity. So I can only say that you would have external devices to regulate the humidity. The cooling system will remove the humidity, and you might need something separate to actually create the humidity again. So yeah, not my sort of specialist area, but that's what I would answer that one with. Just as a sort of comment aside, we are doing a survey for this live stream, just to get some good feedback. So that will be put in the chat, and it will help improve our live streams in the future, as says on the screen. So yeah, we'd really appreciate your input. Thank you very much. Okay, so Shane has put a question up. How can we tackle the challenge of overheating on scroll compressors with 449? Very good question, Shane. 448, 449, we do tend to run quite high discharge temperatures with those refrigerants. And I'll just share my screen again for Danfoss Cool Selector. And you'll see when that comes up on the screen there, again, very, very good way to see what our discharge temperature should be. Now, this is estimated at 77 degrees, which is absolutely fine. We're not going to cause any problems with that. There is a way, and I'll just put something up on the screen from one of the presentations that I did. But basically, the easiest way to do it, Shane, is to fit a discharge gas thermostat on our compressor. And he says, I'll just put that particular slide up and just swap the screens around. And hopefully that will then come up. So there we go. So commissioning checks, discharge temperature. Yeah, the easiest way, Shane, is to fit a discharge gas thermostat on the discharge of the machine. And that will cut out basically at 130 degrees C, and then cut back in, I think it's 15 degrees lower than that from memory. But yeah, that's the easiest way to monitor our discharge gas temperature. The other thing to say is obviously make sure that we're measuring our suction superheat correctly, because that has a huge influence on the discharge temperature of our compressor. And I'm just going to put another picture up in a second, which is that one. Let's go full screen again and just swap it around. So there we go. So the other thing we need to do, we need to measure our superheat on our evaporator, but we also need to measure our total superheat on our system. And you can see there, very similar to what we had up before, we've got our evaporator, we've got our expansion valve, our file, and the same thing, evaporating 134A, 1.42 bar, -5. And then to measure our total superheat, we need to measure the temperature basically at the suction stub of the machine. And you can see there that we are measuring 8 degrees C. So we've got 13 Kelvin total superheat on our machine. Absolutely fine. That compressor will live a nice, long and happy life. If we had, a lot of our machines are okay for a return gas temperature of 20 degrees C, depending on the envelope of the machine. But basically, you've got to keep that machine operating within its envelope, its happy place, as I call it. If you let it outside of that, then the discharge temperature will increase very, very rapidly. The other thing also with the scroll, if you run it short of gas, then the discharge temperature will increase very, very rapidly. So you've got to be very careful during the commissioning process, during the charging process, that you are not letting that discharge temperature get too high. So basically 2 things. 1, fit a discharge gas thermostat as a safety. Don't rely on your HP switch or your LP switch, because you will kill a scroll much quicker than those can react. So discharge gas thermostat is the main one, but also, correct commissioning on the system. Make sure that you've got your total superheat. Okay. So I hope that answers that one, Shane. Another question's come in, which is a very difficult one to answer, from Mohammed. When I started my room air conditioner, after a few minutes the compressor shut down. I honestly, I don't know. It might be short of gas. It might be overheating. It could be many things, Mohammed. So yeah, sorry, I can't sort of take that question, unfortunately. Okay, another question has come in from Rishab. How do we design condensers for refrigeration systems? Well, all I can sort of say really on that point is that our condenser needs to reject the heat that we are removing from one place to another. So we're removing the heat from, if we take a cauldron, for example, and I'll just go to the beautiful whiteboard a minute. So if we look at our, let's do a nice simple system. So we've got our compressor, that's our condenser, that's our expansion device, that's our evaporator. We've got a fan on that one and a fan on that one. So the condenser basically has to reject the heat that we're removing from our evaporator that's in our cauldron, for example, but it's also got to remove the heat of compression from the compressor or compressors, depending on the size of the system. So that's the sort of simplest answer to the design of a system, is the condenser has to remove the heat that we remove from the evaporator, but also the heat of compression that we generate within our compressor as well. So that is a sort of simple answer to a quite technical question. Regarding the the pipe flow and the direction and the pipe size and all of that, that then comes down to how physically large you'd like your condenser to be or how small it needs to be. If it's fin and tube, then you can go smaller pipe, more fins, smaller size. You can go microchannel heat exchanger, which is what we use on our Danfoss condenser units, which for the physical area that they take up, they're quite a high output. So there's various things that we have to take into account for that, Rishab. So I hope that answers that question. Another question has come in from, so how do we measure superheat if we are using thermal expansion valve? I think we covered that one before. Just let me go back to that slide there, and yeah, just let me play around with it again. Let's put that one back up. Okay, so let's see. So how do we measure superheat if we're using thermal expansion valve? It might be we are getting confused with the terms, or I'm getting confused with the terms, Sridhar. If we're using any form of expansion device, we know what we are evaporating at because we can measure our pressure. We convert that to our temperature using our, refrigerant slider, and then we measure the outlet of the evaporator. So we can always measure our superheat that we have on our evaporator. So I hope that answers that question. If not, then yeah, please come back to us in the chat and we can take it a little bit more. Just stop that. Okay. And yeah, obviously, ask many questions. There's quite a few questions that I can see coming in. So another question has come up. Okay, so a question has come in. An evaporator gives 500 watt at -10 evaporating temperature in 0 degrees C room. This is equivalent to 500 watt heater in a not. Yeah, that's a brain teaser, isn't it? An evaporator gives 500 watts at -10 in a 0 degrees C room. So we've got a 10K TD on the coil. This is equivalent to 500 watt heater in a 0 degrees C room. Yeah, that's a bit of a brain teaser. Yeah, I don't know. We'll have to think about that one. All right, let's go to the next question. I can see lots coming in. Zafar answers, what type of unit best for cold room? Yeah, that's quite a challenging question, I guess. Depends what the cold room is, what we're storing in the cold room, what the product is, how big the cold room is, all that sort of thing. So yeah, not possible to answer that. If you can expand on the question, Zafar, then we can take it a little bit further. Another question's come in from Sheriff. What is the design aspects of pre-cooling room, blast chilling for orange? Yeah, there's a good question. I mean, the basics of blast chill or blast freeze for that matter. If we talk about a cold room as such, or a blast chill, blast freeze, I'll just show a sort of basic. And again, this depends, actually. This is quite an interesting question. Is it orange juice, or is it oranges, the fruit? If it was orange juice, then it would go through some form of plate heat exchanger to cool it down. But if we're actually talking oranges, to take the field heat out of an orange, or we're taking them down to a storage temperature. So if we think of a, let's say, blast chilling room, classic sort of way to do it generally, let's do a nice big ceiling mounted evaporator. So we've got our fans, and then we've got our coil block. Generally what you would do is you would store your oranges. If we're talking blast chill, for example, something like this, and you'd have a plenum, which is that part there. Let's make sure the air can get back. And we'd basically blast our air, and this is maybe not to scale, so the air would pass over our product, and then it would come back to our evaporator again. The biggest challenge with any form of blast chill, blast freeze is to actually get the heat exchange from our oranges, so we're actually picking up the heat. If these oranges are stored in a crate, for example, then we need to make sure that the air can actually get through crate itself. If they're in plastic boxes, that's no good because the air can't actually access the actual product that we're trying to cool. So we need to make sure that the crates have gaps in them to allow the air to actually get to the product itself. So it doesn't matter whether we're talking oranges, whether we're talking, meat, anything. The main thing is that air that we're blast chilling has to come into contact with the product itself. So hope that sort of answers that question. Okay, so let's have a look, see who's coming on the chat. So we've got Jafine. Okay, so we've done the aspects of pre-cooling for oranges. Okay, and yeah, let's get some more questions, everybody, because we're a little bit low on the questions today. I'm just seeing what has come in on the question. Okay, okay, so a question that's come in from John. What happens if the condensing unit has a larger capacity than the evaporator and vice versa? That's a good topic, actually. Let me just put another slide up a second. Basically, one of the webinars that we did was the selection match between condensing unit and evaporator. And one of the topics that I get asked a lot when I'm on site is, what defines the evaporating temperature of a system? Is it the evaporator and the condensing unit? Is it my suction pressure? How does it define itself? And basically, when we start looking at sort of system match, and I'll just put this little picture up a second, and then we'll go on to look at some more. So let me just swap the screens around a second. Okay, so let's put that up on the screen. So that should be coming up on the screen. So if we think of a nice, simple cold room refrigeration system, so we've got our condenser unit, our cooler, and the match between those two, so I don't know, let's say that's 10 kilowatt and that's 10 kilowatt, that's matched, and at that match we'll have a particular temperature difference, and that will give us, as we've said before, our humidity on our cold room. So we've got our humidity levels there, and we've got our design TD, our temperature difference between evaporating and air onto the cooler at a specific delta T. And then if we just come down, I'll just come down to some other slides. So if we have a condensing unit that is larger than the evaporator, and I'll just come back to sort of answering the main question. I'll just put the webcam back on, and we'll get back onto the board a minute. So if we've got our condensing unit, and we'll do it this way. We'll look at a compressor. So if we've got our compressor, and then we've got our evaporator. Let's do the condenser expansion device, our evaporator. If that is, let's say, 10 kilowatt, and that's 10 kilowatt, evaporating at zero, that is equally matched. So the capacity of that and the capacity that we can extract from our room is the same. So that system is nicely matched. If, however, we have, let's say, keep 10 kilowatt evaporator, and let's say we have an 8 kilowatt compressor, that compressor is smaller in capacity than the evaporator. So what will happen is that because that is a larger, our suction pressure coming back to our machine will rise. Might not rise by much, might rise by a few PSI, which in effect is good because it's giving our compressor something to work at. If we then change things around a little bit and we say, okay, we've got a 12 kilowatt compressor, that now can do more duty than our evaporator can actually provide. So our suction pressure is going to fall a little bit. And you can work this out on balance graphs, balance tables. Most of it's done nowadays, to be fair, on selection software for the evaporators. But in essence, yeah, if you've got a larger compressor than the evaporator, your suction pressure will fall a little bit. If you have a compressor that's larger than the evaporator, suction pressure will rise a little bit. Generally, this is my own personal feeling. I would much rather have, let's say, a evaporator that is slightly larger than the, let's say, the compressor, the condensing unit part, because our suction pressure will rise, which is good for energy saving. It's also good because we have a higher relative humidity on our cooler because we're not extracting so much moisture out of the room itself. So I hope that answers that one, John. Yeah, that's my namesake, I think, John K. So thank you for that. And Mutazim asks a question. Okay, what happens if the evaporator does not get good airflow? Yeah, one of my sort of favorite topics, I think, is airflow. Let's just, probably let's do it on the whiteboard again. Actually, we can keep that, that picture up there a little bit. Let's just get rid of our capacities. So if we've got our refrigeration system, we've got our compressor, we've got our condenser, we've got our evap, we've got a fan on our condenser, and we've got a fan on our evaporator. If we don't get good airflow on the evaporator, basically the suction pressure coming back to our machine is going to fall. And the reason it falls is because we're not providing that heat exchange on our evaporator. So the machine will, suction pressure will fall and the evaporator will ice up, basically. So we get less capacity from our machine. Airflow can happen for, you know, many reasons. Probably the most common is storage issues within the cold room itself. So again, just looking at our, you know, nice simple cold room, if we have our evaporator where it should be, rule of thumb generally is that that dimension of our evaporator should be that dimension of our evaporator, so that we get good airflow at the back of the coil, and we don't have any issues. I'd probably say the biggest issue for airflow in a cold room is the people who operate the cold room store product on pallets or racking or whatever, you know, basically round the evaporator, so that we are restricting the airflow getting to the back of the evaporator. That's probably the most common problem that I see when I'm on site with cold rooms. So yeah, the evaporator needs good airflow. Okay, so another question is quite a big question has come in, and I'm just looking at it to see. Yeah, that's a good question. Let's put that up on the screen. So, and just let me move that down a little bit if I can. No, I can't. Okay. How can you? Sorry, I'm struggling to read that a little bit, Mr. Moderator, because I can't move my private chat out the way. Oh, the joys of technology. Okay. How can you? So, if you work with a multi-rack that has a specific evaporating temperature, for example, -8 degrees C, how can you have the desired delta T for different cold rooms? For example, the DT would be 8K for the meat cold room on 0C, but for the vegetable cold room on +5 on the DT. Yeah, the simplest way is to, you know, have our rack. So we've got our our rack of our machines. Let's just do it nice and simply. So that's our rack or our pack, depending which part of the world you live in. And we'd have various cauldrons, and let's say what we're evaporating at. We're evaporating, so -8 on our pack, and that would be feeding these various rooms. And we've said there that we would have meat cauldron on 0, but for vegetable cauldron on the, so yeah, so in sort of simple terms, if you wanted your, what do we say, the meat cauldrons at 0, so it'd have 0 degrees C. Let's say we've got a couple of them, so they're the meat cauldrons. And you're evaporating -8, so we want those at 0, and you wanted an 8K TD, so those are evaporating at -8, which is fine because the rack's doing -8 and they're evaporating at -8. And then we wanted veg room, which was a bit warmer. So then basically you would have an evaporator pressure regulator on that evaporator just to raise the evaporating temperature in that room, so that we are, and what did we say? I think we said +5. So we would just have an EPR on that suction, basically to raise the evaporating temperature of that evaporator. Yeah, that's the simplest way to do it. So hope that answers that question. Okay, another question's come in about capillary tube. Oh, that's going back some years. For a bottle cooler, if length of capillary is longer than recommended, how it impacts the cooling performance. I must admit, I'm not an expert on capillary tube. We did have some, and I think we might still have some good selection software for capillary tube. I'm not sure. At least we used to have it, called Danfoss years ago. Basically, a capillary tube is an expansion device, and basically the way that a capillary tube works is that it is a very small tube, as in a capillary, and I've got to get this right because it's not something that I've spent a lot of time on, to be honest. So let's think about it. If you've got let's have a think. So if you've got a capillary tube, which is basically that, but it's very, very small, it acts as a restriction device. So if you have a longer capillary tube, you have a greater pressure drop across it. So you would have a good question. See if anybody in the audience can help us with this one, because yeah, capillary tube is a bit of an interesting one for me. I've got to think about it now. Nice restriction. So if we have a small restriction, would we have a high capacity or a small capacity? I don't know. Let's have a think about that one. That's a good question to Fram. We'll come back to that one. Let's see if somebody can put that in the chat who is an expert in capillary tube. Okay, another question's come in by Jaroslow. So what would be the lowest recommended superheat for electronic expansion valve? Yeah, there's a good question. Let's come back to that capillary tube one. That's an interesting one. I'm going to look at that later on. I would say for an electronic expansion valve, you don't want to go any lower than sort of 5 or 6 Kelvin. That to me is plenty low enough. Obviously, you have to think about your system, the design of the system, length of the suction line back to the machine. You know, there's various, let's say, challenges. If you have your, let's just do our nice simple system again. So that's our evap, that's our condenser again. If you've got an electronic expansion device, an EEV. We control the EEV by a pressure transducer that measures suction pressure, and then we have a temperature sensor that is controlled by our controller, something like that, and that measures that, and then controls that in a positive or a negative. So we open and close it accordingly. So 6K, it would be absolutely fine. I wouldn't go any lower than that. The thing that I always think practically, that distance. Now, if we've got 30 meters of pipe, I'd be a little bit more flexible, because you've got 30 meters of pipe, picking up a bit of superheat in that line, absolutely fine. If that was, let's go daft, 2 meters, you've only got 2 meters between the exit of your evaporator and your machine. So you're not going to pick up much heat externally in that 2 meters. So you've really got to look after your superheat on that evaporator. But in general terms, if we're talking electronic expansion valve, then 6K wouldn't really go any lower than that. If we're talking mechanical, yeah, 8, 9, somewhere around there, I would be quite happy with that. So I hope that answers that question. Okay, this is quite a detailed question, and not in this not in this sort of format. Addy asks, can you explain the steps for setting the PID parameters on a EKC controller? Not really, because that's a little bit more involved than what we're doing today. Basically, what I can say is that in the EKC controllers, the PID is set up, and it's set up at a predefined parameters that, you know, we as Danfoss have decided is sort of the best. But you can speed up and slow down the regulation of the controllers to suit your purposes, if you like. But yeah, that's a little bit more involved than what we're going to go into today. I'm trying not to go into, you know, specific sort of products, because that means pulling up data sheets and all that sort of stuff. But please contact your local technical support, and they will be able to help you on that. That shouldn't be a problem at all. Another question's come in from Saga. How can we troubleshoot refrigeration system expansion valve hunting? Very good question. I was actually on site a couple of weeks ago with exactly this problem, to be honest, with a valve that was hunting, and it basically turned out to be a problem with, let's say, the evaporator rather than anything else. The reason a expansion valve hunts is because it can't get a good signal and it can't regulate. Now, we've sort of spoken a bit about these sort of topics on you know, setting your superheat and all that sort of thing, and we've got lots of this type of information in our infographic library, on various videos we've got, etc. So you can learn a lot. Also the Danfoss e-learning, things like that. We show lots of information in there about how to set up systems. My camera's just gone a bit fuzzy, so I'm just going to try and get it to focus again. It does this every now and again for some reason. Come on, Mr. Camera, behave yourself. So yeah, let's go back to this sort of topic on how can we troubleshoot a expansion valve. Basically, we need to make sure that the valve is installed correctly. We need to make sure that the bulb, the sensing file, is on the outlet of the evaporator. We need to make sure the sensing file is before the equalization line. You need to make sure that that bulb has good thermal contact with the suction pipe. That is, you know, critically important, because that's how the valve actually works. If you think the valve is hunting, then it could be refrigerant charge, it could be bad thermal contact of the bulb itself. It might be the fact of airflow across the evaporator. So rule out all of those issues before you, think there is a problem with the valve itself. And the camera's just come back now again. I'm just trying to think if I've got a box of tricks somewhere, but I've got a valve in bit somewhere that I could sort of show you a little bit better. But now the camera's decided to do its thing a bit better. Is if we think of our how can we do this nice and simply? So if we look at our evaporator, so we've got our coil block in our evaporator. We've got our suction line coming out of our evaporator. We've got our liquid line coming in. Let's do that over here. Actually, no, let's be naughty, look, and do it what doesn't happen in real life. But we'll have the liquid coming in here to our expansion device. And then that feeds our coil with our distributor. Now, what we need from our expansion device is we need our sensing bulb, as we said, on the suction line, good thermal contact. Please use the bulb strap that comes with the valve. Don't use tie wraps, electrical tape, anything like that, because the bulb strap that straps the bulb onto the suction line actually does it with enough force to deform the bulb itself, so it gives it a slight flat spot and gives a really good thermal contact. If we've got an externally equalized valve, then we'll have the, and again, this is for graphical representation only, but make sure that the equalization line is after the bulb. We do that basically for one reason and one reason only. If there is any leakage on the equalization line from the valve, it doesn't affect the signal that we're going to pick up on the bulb here. So make sure that is nice and tight, make sure it's insulated, make sure the equalization line is after the bulb. A very basic one, but something that we see, or I see a lot on evaporators. If we talk about our distributor, and let's do it that way. So that's our distributor, liquid feeding in from our expansion valve. If the distributor's pointing downwards, we get very good liquid distribution in all the distributor leads. In a lot of cases, you'll see the distributor is basically pointing upwards and then feeding into the coil. Not the greatest for liquid distribution. So get the sort of basics right on the evaporator first. Make sure we've got good airflow, as we said, from the our cauldron roof. Make sure we've got a nice gap at the back. It's all about the basics. If we get the basics right of that expansion valve, then it should do its duty. Make sure that it is, the right size. Again, we can use Danfoss Cold Selector for that. Do a product selection. So, hope that sort of answers that, Sagar, a little bit. Another question's come in from, and sorry for my pronunciations of your names, so apologies for that. Okay, so how to improve the superheat in the evaporators? Well, in simple terms, as we said in one of the sort of drawings that I did previously, the more liquid we can feed into that evaporator, the more capacity we get out of that evaporator. How to improve the superheat? Well, we need to get good installation of the expansion valve, as we've just done. Make sure everything's reading right. If you want to control a very tight superheat, then electronic expansion valve is, I would say, the way to go, because you can run a tighter superheat, so a smaller superheat, so you get more capacity out of that evaporator. Good airflow across the evaporator, things like that. If you want to have a very good superheat in an evaporator, then you run a flooded system, but that's more the realms of industrial refrigeration rather than sort of commercial. So it comes down to the basics: good expansion valve, right capacity, right installation, good airflow across the coil. All those sort of things, will give you good capacity in your system. So Mohammed asks a question: how do you distinguish between non-condensable and overcharged? Well, if you've got non-condensables in your system, just turn the system off, let the pressures equalize out, and your pressure in your system should be equal to our lovely comparator. If it's not, then you've got non-condensables in there because your pressure is higher. So always use your pressure temperature relationship on your comparator or on your phone, and that will tell you whether you've got any non-condensables in your system. So yeah, any more questions? Let's have some more questions. If not, as I said, we've got lots of Danfoss information. We've got lots of videos regarding cauldrons. We've got all the infographic material. Hope you've all done the survey to try and improve the live streams that we do from Danfoss. Things like that. So yeah, hopefully this has been fairly good. I'm sure we'll be doing more webinar series on various topics, so we'd really appreciate your thoughts on what else we can do regarding live streams, what else we can do for webinar series, things like that. Yeah, really appreciate any comments. Yeah, so if there's no more questions, then have we got any more questions coming in? Okay, so thank you very much, everybody, for today. I hope it was useful, and I look forward to seeing you again.